Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ehsan Garajadaki, clinical psychologist, and today, was part of the series about addiction, I'm dedicating this video to the question of family members asking, especially parents asking, why my child, why my son, why my daughter, in terms of how and why their child got addicted. A lot of times it comes as a disbelief, and people are quite surprised and shocked, contrary to their assumption that it would not affect their child and their son or daughter or even grandchildren would be spared from the evil of addiction. So, and at times, in fact, sometimes we can reverse this. Sometimes it's the children that are asking, why my dad, why my mom? How come they became addicted? And it's kind of impossible for them to wrap their mind around. So we want to answer that. In order to really answer this question, I want to split it into two halves. One is why the person is using drugs, because that's the ultimate focus that we have in terms of addiction. Now, certainly addiction could be also addiction to sex or gambling or gaming or a few other types of addictive behaviors, but here our focus is mostly substance abuse. So the first part that we want to answer is why a person is using drugs, and the second part is how come that they came to using drugs. So these are two-part question, actually, when a person is wondering about the addictive trajectory of their child. So the first part of why do people use drugs? I have a graph that I would like to show and make this a little bit easier to understand, which is basically we have a baseline right here in terms of a person's feelings. We generally, and this is very well established phenomenon, that we know a concept of human beings wanting, always a kind of being wired for this movement away from pain toward pleasure. And that's why you see this graph that certainly nobody wants to be in pain, and most people, when most time and most days of their life, they're at a baseline. They're not necessarily in pain, and they're not necessarily ecstatic about their life. So they're kind of okay, let's say, and a very calm or relaxed type of a normalcy, let's say. Now, generally, again, we know from many research that has been done over the past, not only scientifically in terms of the realm of psychology, from Freudian psychology, from behavioral psychology, from operant conditioning, classical conditioning, from concepts of CBT, cognitive behavioral theory, etc., Milan's dimensions of personality and so forth, that people are prone to want to stay away from pain and want to gravitate toward pleasure. So some of the areas that a person may actually feel pain, they are listed below, such as disappointment, fear, abandonment, rejection, shame, guilt, naturally, interactions, reactions, exchanges that basically cause emotional pain. And some also, we could throw in concepts of worrying, if a person is worried or quite sad, let's say. But then they are linked, they're more like feelings that are linked to more or less certain interactions between a person and their environment. Now, many people use drugs to stay away from these feelings. At times they have somehow been exposed to these intense, extremely painful feelings, and they're escaping those feelings. So they numb themselves to these feelings, and at times they even need these drugs on a daily basis to get back to that baseline, to even function as a normal human being, to go to work, to be awake, to interact with their environment, to respond to requests and demands from family members. But also, many times people actually use not because of pain. They may just kind of they have programmed themselves to really seek a lot of pleasurable outcome or activities or states of mind, if you will, both body and mind, such as a sense of bliss or love or excitement, happiness, even just calmness and relaxation. Some people want to be energetic, and they have found that some drugs or basically substances give them this sense of energy and euphoria and happiness that they can chase, and they wouldn't be able to get that from non-substance related actions or activities. So this is, first of all, why people actually use any type of a mind-altering substance. They would inject it absorb it in their body in order to either stay away from pain or seek pleasure. Now, so there's really no surprise, in fact, that a person, a human being, no matter whose child or parent or sibling it is, would function this way, because literally people more or less have to comply with their nature. Now, question may come here, well, why substance and drugs? Why not other types of, let's say, tools or resources in order for a person to actually feel the same types of effect, whether it is an effect of reducing pain or effect of increasing pleasure. An example would be someone may come up with the notion of, let's say, business success or success in family relationships, interpersonal relationships. Someone may suggest, well, why would my son or daughter or parent or whoever not be fond of who they are and their own skills, let's say their interpersonal skills, maybe even, again, business acumen, maybe running a business, being successful in life, affording things, making money, making advancement in society or science and whatnot. Well, then that's where we have to go back to the question of how did they come to be this way? How did they come to choose drugs versus a different resource? As I mentioned, I can categorize everything else under a resource. So in order to understand that, what we have to really look at is what we call developmental stages of growth. Every human being is functioning according to a certain developmental stages of growth model. We have known this about human beings too for millennia, and scientifically it has been very well researched over the past probably 70, 80 years. And I have summarized it again in this graph that shows more or less important hallmarks of the stages of growth that we want to pay attention to. The actual model, which is the Erickson's psychosocial developmental stages of growth, is much more complex and more detailed than this, but I have condensed it into a few hallmarks that we want to pay attention to for the sake of time and brevity. So let's look at that. What are those hallmarks? Certainly birth is the first hallmark, and then right after about 7 to 8 years, between 8 and 12, we have another important hallmark that is physiologically, psychologically, socially very important, and that's puberty, when people go through puberty. And then there is a major hallmark that actually is not emphasized as much as it should be, which I call here primal maturity. And the reason for that is right around 15 years of age, is that a few of main areas of our functioning, such as cognitive, behavioral, habitual, emotional, moral, and social interactional development, they reach a minimal level of maturity, where a person, despite the fact that they're still legally called a minor, they could literally survive on their own. Right about 15 years of age, people have developed at least cognitively an abstract way of thinking beyond the concrete way of thinking that is the basis of cognitive, at least Piaget's cognitive development, and that is good enough for them to be able to grasp some concepts on their own and really figure things out. So that allows for inception, more or less, of some creativity in their lives and resourcefulness, so they can just survive on their own. If they were abandoned in the middle of somewhere on an island, they would figure things out. Emotionally, they would have enough resources to be able to deal with situations. Again, so it's all about survival. It's not necessarily about optimal level of life and development. So, and that's why it's important. Right about 15 years, again, I call it primal maturity. This is, I made it up. This is not in the literature, but there is enough information about this age and those areas of functioning that you can look up. Now, what follows is certainly age of majority. And usually, right, kind of globally, we know that about 18 years of age, people are regarded no longer as minors, but as more like adults, and they have certain rights, both socially, legally, culturally. They gain a certain status in life, and that is also very, very important. And then certainly individual actualization or self-actualization or individual growth after that follows, with a person really kind of going out there in the world and really actually creating their own family. So leaving the family of origin and embarking on a journey of creating their future. But why this is important is because literally most people don't pay attention to what happens to a person during these years. And we know that most, first time of, or most instances of first time of drug use in people's lives that we know of and have studied starts right around 12, 13, 14 years of age, so early teenage years. Now, there are certainly many cases where a person has used earlier than that. We have many drug addicts who have started when they were 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 5-year-old, you name it. It's all over the place. There are even people who come to world having been prenatally exposed to drugs because of their mother having used alcohol or cigarettes or heroin or methamphetamine, etc. But what we know, the majority of cases, maybe 90+% of more or less voluntary, at least, cases of drug use, they have started right around between puberty, right after puberty, perhaps, especially right around 12, 13 years of age, and then about 15, 16, it kind of culminates and solidifies, and it gets much, much worse right after that. So why I bring this up again is because I want to get most people's attention, especially in this case parents, not children, but parents' attention to understand and really kind of use their curiosity about what happened. So here we want to answer the question of what and how. So not necessarily why. We know why people use. We talked about that. But the question is, how come that my child needed to numb themselves to certain pain during this period? Or how come that they needed to get some pleasure that they couldn't get from other activities during these formative years from drugs? So let's pay attention a little bit to what happens right around this part. Number one, what happens is that a few things. The stages of growth and the developmental stages of growth, they have actual name for this, which is right around 6 years, after 6, 7 years, when people go into a public arena, beyond their family environment, especially a school environment. We have a stage called inferiority versus industry, which is basically through interactions with peers, kids learn to really develop certain skills. And that's the very earliest time that they actually have the opportunity of sorting out independently from their family of origin within a more or less strange environment that they're exposed to rely heavily on their own inner skills and strengths, as well as discover certain weaknesses about themselves. So, and that is very important because it really depends how a child goes through this type of kind of an exposure to strangeness, to challenges, to conflicts that arise in a peer-to-peer environment, and how they reflect on that, and how the environment reflects on that. Basically, the question that we want to ask ourselves and answer it is, did they come out of this stage into a later stage that we call identity formation, right around 12 years of age? That's kind of post-puberty, entering into that, what I mentioned, after, right before the primal maturity, between about 12 to 18, that is regarded the identity formation. But the transition from that industry development versus inferiority to identity development, what is that transition like? Did the person come out from this transition stronger and more confident? Did they develop some self-esteem? Were they able to discover something exciting? Are they using their curiosity in the right direction? And certainly, we want to take into consideration the impact of the environment. Are they getting any good guidance from people around them? And again, it's not just from the parents. As we know, a lot of times, younger individuals, the youth, is more impacted and influenced by their peers and friends than by their actual parents. And even they're more influenced by their siblings than by the parents. So it's a combination of these factors that the parent would want to kind of revisit. And if they're wondering how come my child got involved with drugs, we want to look at that formidable time frame in terms of how did my child transition out of that phase of industry, kind of figuring out their strengths and weaknesses, into their identity formation stage. What were they exposed to? Who were the influencers in their lives? What kind of a guidance and support did they get from people closest to them? What was the level of self-esteem and self-confidence that ultimately determined certain decisions that they have made? Now, the other part to this, also remember that at this stage, between 12 and 15, abstract thinking hasn't kicked in yet. So with that in mind, kids are prone to really think concretely about things. So let's say if they are exposed, and that's the other factor too, exposure to certain outside influencers, including, let's say, drug dealers or people or friends who use drugs, not that they're dealers, but they're just they're kind of vicarious dealers, if you will, or pseudo dealers, because they may be using and they may freely provide that to their friends. And so these two other factors are coming in, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is lack of abstract thinking, so very black and white, concrete thinking, being influenced by and exposed to these outside influencers. And there is a little bit of freedom, certainly, that we can easily overlook. As parents, we cannot control every single minute of the life of our child. So certainly through that type of a freedom and within the kind of biopsychosocial model of functioning, because a child has their own thinking, their own reflections, their own interaction, their own decision making, and being exposed to these influencers, not really understanding kind of the bigger concept about what drugs can use, and that would be the necessity for abstract thinking. A person cannot foresee possibilities, probabilities. They don't have that ability at that stage. So if they're offered something by a friend and says, "Hey, this should make you feel good. Take this and see. Life can be beautiful, wonderful," and they just take it. It's very black and white. My friend said that. I trust my friend. I want to try it. What's the worst that can happen? You usually get that type of a self-reflective question to which there's really no good answer, because usually people say, well, the heck with it, let's just try it. They think they're invincible. That's the other prominent characteristic of youth, that they, based on the higher level of energy that they have, they literally believe that they can overcome anything in life. So all these components are active at that moment. They're exposed to these environmental factors, especially negative environmental factors such as drugs, and boom, that combination happens to deliver this unwanted, later on, unwanted experience. At that time, it is very much wanted, and that is again based on their level of emotional pain or lack of emotional euphoria that they are feeling at that stage of life. They may simply choose to, erroneously, mistakenly, to be exposed to drugs, not thinking that it could have literally devastating and destructive consequences for the rest of their life. So now once that happens, then I got to throw in, I would say, another important factor, and that is something that we know now as a part of the disease model of addiction, which is impairment in brain development. So no matter when that occurs, so I'm going to just throw that in, brain impairment, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So anytime between kind of early stages, as even prior to puberty, but most likely after that, between 12 years and more or less anytime after that, when a person is starting to use drugs, but especially in these formidable years, because the brain still continues developing at least until 25 years of age, maybe even later. But these are the formidable stages where the brain is still developing. The neurons are developing, new neurons are created, neural pathways are being kind of etched out in the brain and developed, and they can be impaired by the impact of the drugs that they have on neurotransmitters, neuroreceptors, neuropathways, neurons, and neuronal development within the brain. And as a result, when neuronal changes take place, they also impact all these other ways of functioning, which is basically, for instance, cognitive development can be impaired. So, for instance, a person's decision making, we know that from experience that drug addicts who are kind of used to just using drugs, they have a very faulty decision-making system. They always make bad decisions, and then they rationalize that into somehow very justifiable, momentary good decision-making in that moment. That's part of it is due to the fact that there is some brain impairment, cognitive impairment in the brain that is linked to the neurobiology of our brain. Emotional, habitual, social, moral, interpersonal areas of development and functioning, they're all determined by our brain function. If anything we do in life is really guided and impacted heavily by the way our neurons function. Now, if we have drugs in the system, and you never know when that started, that have more or less left an imprint on the very cells that actually are linked to any of these areas of functioning, then there is no question, there's no wonder. I don't know why people would even be wondering about how come that their child makes bad decisions. How come that they steal or they cheat or they manipulate? How they kind of become very much self-deprecating as well as demeaning to other individuals in their lives. They continuously lie, and despite knowing the negative consequences of their drug use, they still continue using it. So they become very much self-destructive and sabotaging their lives. It's actually to be expected. And now I wanted to really provide this video for you to really focus on these two components. If you're asking how come your child, well, we know why they're using and we know how they came to be using. So these are the two important trajectories. If you still have questions and doubts in terms of, well, you may not be able to wrap your mind around very specifics in terms of what specifically happened to, let's say, your child when they were, let's say, 13-year-old. And you may remember something like, for instance, okay, they were under some peer pressure, there was something going on, there was a little bit of distance between maybe family members, there was nobody around to guide them, but everybody regrets it, everybody is remorseful. However, something happened at that time, but you still don't quite understand exactly the details of how it happened. Don't despair. That's why treatment is there and therapy is there and recovery is there. So those are the remedies to these types of questions and situations. As long as you understand how they came to be in this particular situation, that's a big step forward, because you can be part of the improvement of a person and really kind of develop a certain common language with them to understand where they come from and how come they're here, and that's a good start, because if you, as long as you are involved in their future, that's a good news. And I would certainly welcome you to reach out. If you have any questions, comments, please post it, or even reach out directly to me. I'll be happy to help. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.